good man is Jack White.
Yeah, well, you've got lots of knowledge on Jack, and this one's on the number of photographs that were being taken per minute. That one hasn't been discussed. I mean, this article has been up for years, but we've never actually discussed the number of photographs that were actually taken and how many per minute. When you have one person doing all the photography out there and the number of photographs, they couldn't possibly have been doing anything else. And that's what this article's about.
That's right, yeah. 5,771 exposures over the 6 missions. That's quite an easy figure to reach, actually. You can just add them up. So that's 1.19 photographs every minute of time on the moon, regardless of other activities.
Yeah, well, Jack has broken it down in this article as to each mission. You'll see all of the timelines in there. When you start to realize that, it was a photographic exercise is what the thing was.
Yeah, exactly. Because it was the photographs which everybody keeps getting referred to as being the evidence for the landing, which is ridiculous. When we now know that photographic film cannot work in a vacuum, makes the whole thing complete nonsense.
Absolutely.
So the idea that the photographs are a record of man's activities on the lunar surface, 240,000 miles away from Earth, is nonsense. But it's only now, with the information that we've acquired as a result of the vacuum testing and the more detailed examination of the photographic record, we can see what complete fabrication it was. The whole thing was fabricated.
Interesting how Apollo 11 had 121, Apollo 12, 504, Apollo 14, 374, Apollo 15, 1021, Apollo 16, 1765, and last but not least, Apollo 17, 1986, 1,986 photos. Now, Apollo 11, 1 EVA, 2 hours 31 minutes, Apollo 12, 2 EVAs, 7 hours 50 minutes, Apollo 14, 2 EVAs, 9 hours 25 minutes, Apollo 15, 3 EVAs, 18 hours 30 minutes, Apollo 16, 3 EVAs, 20 hours 14 minutes, last but not least, Apollo 17, 3 EVAs, 22 hours and 4 minutes. Total minutes on the moon amounted to 4,834 minutes. Total number of photographs taken was 5,771 photos. That amounts to 1.19 photos taken every single minute of time on the moon, regardless of all other activities. That's crazy.
It is. It is.
And yet we don't have anything from Artemis 1 that went out there, a craft that didn't have any humans on board. But I would like to see what happens when they get to Artemis 3. How many photographs and films and videos are they going to have when they get to that mission? Are they going to have all these cameras? Are they going to have all these digital photographs? What are they going to do? I mean, we already saw what happened with Artemis 1. We do not have one single photo, video, anything from all those other 21 cameras they had on board. We only have video from the one camera and the other camera that was mounted to the solar panel. But that's all we have. That's all they've publicly displayed. I've looked all over the internet. Don't know about you guys, but I haven't found any.
No, I haven't found any either. I've looked. A lot of people have looked, but not many people have commented on that. That there are so few actual photographs, which would have to be taken with digital cameras nowadays, because we know that photographic film doesn't work in a vacuum. It doesn't affect digital cameras the same way. And of course, all the photographs taken, it's not including the amount of time they spent filming either.
Well, of course, and then NASA claims that that was done remotely.
Well, they haven't explained how they did all the technical link-ups between the camera and Earth if they did it remotely.
Except there was no controls on the DAC camera.
No, there weren't.
By the way, I've never seen in any of the photographs, when you're looking at the equipment on the rover when they're out traveling around, they must have had more cartridges for the DAC camera on board. And the only thing you see are the magazines when they're lifting up the seats. You never see any other thing other than just the Hasselblad. I've looked for that. Like, where's this extra equipment? I mean, it's probably available just offset that they can give to them. When they're taking a break after they're filming, and they can recharge all of that stuff and put fresh batteries in for them. But I mean, they're not in the photographs that they're trying to show. But when you realize that even when they were practicing this stuff for the time frame, the amount of hours that they were so-called on the lunar surface, they couldn't accurately do that on Earth. Doesn't matter where you're practicing. Of course, the environment is going to be completely foreign to you. Have no idea what the lunar surface is like and how much more difficult it would be. And if they were claiming that they were having a problem with dust on everything, that would take more time to work with the equipment. Even to set up the experimental equipment would cause a problem. And at no time did you ever see them practicing in a vacuum.
No, you didn't.
And that's a whole different situation when you have that spacesuit inflated. Your grasp is going to be completely different. If you imagine trying to close your fingers when they're trying to pop out, they're going to be as hard as a basketball, right? And you're trying to close your fingers on stuff to be able to work. They never practiced that. And even if they claim that it was done in a swimming pool, that has no effect on their suit. It doesn't affect their mobility.
Yeah. The restrictions on the suits would have mitigated against much of this photography anyway. Because you've got a camera that you can't see the shutter button from inside your spacesuit. You don't know if you've taken a picture because you can't hear anything. And yet there are so few photographs which are, should we say, inadvertent shutter releases, as NASA describes them. There are a few, but there are very few photographs which are evidently wrongly composed or wrongly exposed. They're much more the exception than the rule. I think what Jack White has done here, it's a pretty simple analysis, really. It's just taking facts from the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal and the Apollo record and looking at the photographs and thinking, oh, what wonderful photographs they've got. And then you look at the problems of actually taking the photographs under the conditions that we're told existed, and you come to the conclusion it wasn't done on the moon. It was done here on Earth.
You'd have to be a bit of a genius with a Hasselblad camera, considering the fact that all of the controls are manual. To even take average every 50 seconds, you're going to be taking a photograph. And you've got to refocus that. You've got to do everything on that camera to take those pictures. And of course, they're taking panoramics, so the angle of the sun is changing all the time. So they're going to have to change all of the settings on that camera to account for that. I mean, that in itself would be impossible. If you can't see a viewfinder, you can't see the controls on the camera either.
No, you can't. There's some very good comments right at the end of the article by John P. Costello. He's a physicist living in Australia. These comments would have been made many years ago. Apollo debate. This is the comment John P. Costello made. Apollo debates are usually dominated by physics arguments, which can be confusing for most people. Jack White's analysis is breathtaking in its simplicity. Now anyone can understand the evidence and come to their own conclusion. That's a pretty good summary of it. It's just looking at numbers and relating the numbers to the conditions under which those photographs were taken. There's another good comment here from Carl Miller in the USA. Great work, excellent site, is one summary. He says in his comments, very much enjoyed your analysis of the number of NASA photographs versus time available. I am also a professional photographer, so I can appreciate your conclusion given the almost artistic qualities of a lot of the shots that are supposedly not framed, but somewhat randomly captured. At the rate they would have needed to be taken, the whole series of photographs from each mission should be expected to play almost like a movie if you were to flip through them. With manual metering and the difficult light conditions, I find it very hard to believe that they had such a phenomenal quality rate and that they didn't trash can at least 25% or more of the total. For Apollo 11, you have 121 shots. That would not be unreasonable to assume that they actually shot upwards of 200 frames. if each shot on every mission was a usable shot, then that in itself would be a phenomenal feat. Obviously, this would make the already ridiculous photo versus time rate even more beyond the realm of possibility. That's a good summary too.
Yes, well, when you look at the photographic record, there isn't a photograph missing, right? They're in sequential numbers.
Yep, they are.
And that's not just demonstrated by them showing the numbers because a computer can automatically do that, right? Put it in a sequence. But the ones on March to the Moon where the actual photographic number is on the magazine itself, they're right there. To take all of those photographs without doing any bracketing or anything else.
Yep.
And they are in that sequence, right? And they're all beautiful pictures. I mean, that in itself is an anomaly. And I guess anyone that's a camera expert, you know, like McKeegan or something, should know that.
Of course they should, but they're not prepared to discuss it. They're not prepared to look at the basic facts, which are outlined in Jack White's article here. Jack White was himself a photo analyst. He examined a lot of the JFK photographs before he looked at the moon landings. And his conclusion on the moon landings is just straightforward. Couldn't happen. Didn't happen. It was all faked.
Yeah. I don't think McKeegan, as a matter of fact, has ever worked with a film camera, let alone a manually operated film camera. Okay? Because that in itself, just that very fact that all of those photographs are taken with that, and they're in perfect focus, framing, and everything else in the photographs. There are a few anomalies in there, but when you look at the sheer number of them that are taken like that, that couldn't possibly happen when you're in any kind of environment. You even put a suit on like that and some big gloves on and try and operate that and mount it off your chest. And March to the Moon shows that all of those photographs are in sequential number. And if he claims to be a photographic expert, he would understand that. But the fact is, he's never operated a camera like that. He's probably never operated a manually controlled camera. Everything's digital with automatic settings. That's where he fails to understand anything about this process.
Yeah, I think it's where a lot of people fail to understand about the process, because many people commenting nowadays on the photography haven't used a film camera. They don't know the problems. They don't know the details of a manually operated camera. They're not used to it. Cameras today are very, very good, very effective. They've got a nice little computer chip inside them, which tells the exposure and the aperture, and in some cases, even the focus is automatic. On these cameras on Apollo, nothing was automatic. The focus wasn't automatic. The exposure wasn't automatic. You had to point it in the right general direction, and in order to do that, you needed a viewfinder, which wasn't part of the Hasselblad camera. It didn't have a viewfinder. Not the LUNAR Hasselblads, the ones allegedly used on the moon, because they took it away. And anyway, it wouldn't be much use. You couldn't get your head down close enough to see the viewfinder if you're wearing a spacesuit. So you had to just point it around, just generally do it yourself.
And you need a little light meter.
NASA thought of that. They put a little chart on the top of the camera, which you could see from inside your spacesuit. Basically, it's the standard simple explanation that Kodak used to include with every film, because they wanted their customers to get the best results they could. If the sun was behind you, which is the standard way of taking a photograph, if the sun was behind you, the exposure would be, let's say, f8. If the sun was coming from the side, it would be different. If you were shooting with the sun in front of you, the exposure would be different again because of the way the sun illuminates the subject. This was what was happening on the moon. They were being told to put the aperture setting at a certain point. Well, that's fine if you could see the aperture setting to adjust it, but you couldn't if you're wearing a spacesuit and you had the camera mounted on your chest. So when you start looking into all these details, and some people might say they're irrelevant details, of course they practiced. They took their cameras home with them. They practiced at their barbecues and their parties. Yes, they did. It's not difficult to practice with a camera, but under the conditions that they're supposed to be operating under on the moon, they couldn't achieve those conditions here on Earth because they didn't know what they were. Certainly not before Apollo 11. Then they might have got a little bit better because they had more robotic missions photographing the surface, and all the fuss about them disappearing into the dust. That was what was expected to happen before they even got there. But they proved that would not happen when the unmanned surveyor craft landed on Surveyor Crater, the location for the Apollo 12 mission.
What else is interesting, just because you brought it up, they had all these cameras to practice with. Where are those magazines? Yeah. Where are the photographs from their practice? It got to be part of the Apollo record. They should be stored and cared for as much as anything if it's going to be a historical event. All of their practice shots there'd be thousands of magazines, because you didn't just have those astronauts, you had 60 astronauts that were practicing.
That's right. And of course, all those films would be the property of NASA, who had paid for them and given them to the astronauts to practice with. Same as the cameras were the property of NASA.
They all had a 6-week training course.
Yeah. So come on, NASA, where are those photographs that the astronauts used to do their practice missions with? Their barbecues, their families.
Well, they practiced at Flagstaff. That's in the Finney file. 60 astronauts are out taking photographs of that entire scenery. Where are those? Because I'd like to compare those with the ones of the Apollo record.
The only place you're going to find the barbecue scenes where Life magazine and all the other ones were banging at the doors of the astronaut and their wives is on The Right Stuff. That's it. But it's all recreated. There's no originals in that show. Of the barbecue scenes, where are they all? And look at the pictures, look at the photos. I mean, you'd think one of the family members would have at least uploaded 1, 2, 3 photos of them doing this. So I have to go over into video footage from The Right Stuff to put it in here. That's pretty sad.
Yeah, it is indeed. Or maybe the astronauts didn't bother practicing with their camera because they knew they weren't going to go to the moon.
Now we're talking about the Mercury mission, though. That's where I have to get them from. There's nothing on the Apollo missions either. As a matter of fact, they don't even show you any pictures or video in any movies that have not been recreated of a barbecue, a picnic, anything. There's nothing there. I've looked for these videos. I can't find them. If somebody can, please send them our way.
Yeah, because that will demonstrate a little bit that what the astronauts were doing was correct. Where are those?
Well, there are a few photographs of them on their geological sites, especially around the Grand Canyon and stuff like that. And a few shots on the rover, but just very few.
Yeah, but you don't see any of their families. You don't see the picnics. You don't see barbecues that they all had together. You don't even see that from the Mercury missions. You don't see any of it. Private, that is. Now, I've only seen 1 or 2 photographs of them in the living room watching their husbands going up in those capsules, but you don't see anything else. You don't see any family photos of them having parties and things of that nature. That's what I'm saying.
And you would expect the Apollo astronauts at least to be virile men rushing around the country in their Corvettes or whatever car they were using, flying in aircraft.
Well, they were sequestered while they were in their training.
Yeah, but they were still taking photographs.
All of their practice events that they were having at Flagstaff, I would like to see all of those magazines, because that's where they were setting up the stations to practice with. They were taking the photographs. I mean, that's documented as well in the cue cards. That's how the cue cards were created in those practice sessions. So all of those photographs that are listed in the cue cards that they practice with to get that timeline down between the different stations, there must be photographs to match that in their practice sessions alone. And the only thing I can see is that that practice session turned out to be the official record of Apollo. Those photographs.
Yeah.
And that's what you do realize. There should be another set where they practice with shooting all these things. And then those photographs would have many mistakes in them.
Yeah, you'd expect it to have mistakes.
Now, I can see that there might be a few magazines that they happen to be visiting Hugh Hefner at the grotto that they'd remove those photographs. They wouldn't want to have those ones in their official record, but the ones that they were practicing with, where they set it up and they surveyed everything at Flagstaff. They set up the stations there. They dug a model of Hadley Rill there, the whole 9 yards, and they were practicing with that on the rover in their suits, full dress, to do that. Some of them were not full dress sessions, so we should see photographs of them with that as well.
Of course we should. We should see a record of the practice sessions.
Yes.
That would be a very interesting experience to see what they were doing, how they were doing it.
Those training sessions are mentioned in the Finney file. In the Finney file, it even gives a list of the amount of equipment that they were using while they were practicing, which means they had extra cameras, extra magazines, extra batteries. They always had 2 rovers available on the practice set and a model of the LEM.
It's probably the same one used in Capricorn 1.
Well, the model of the LEM is the same one Buzz Aldrin came out of that didn't have an interior in it because there was no console, just a shell.
Yeah, it wasn't on the moon either.
Right. But all of that in their practice sessions should be there. They do list that they had extra backpacks for them to run around with. In the Finney file, they had extra backpacks, extra rovers, extra cameras, extra magazines, extra batteries, all of that stuff on there, as well as the mock-up of the experimental equipment.
Because they had to practice with these things.
That's right.
They had to know how to carry it, how far to carry it. It was all planned in advance, but we don't see any records of it.
Possibly that record is transferred into the official record. The photographs are taken in their practice sessions, have been put together, and they just put them together and claim they're all in one magazine for 40 because they could have shot 10 or 15 magazines worth to get all those shots in and pick the best ones.
That's probably what happened. Some of the sequences of the photographs, looking through each photograph magazine in sequence, you should, as a photographer, be able to work out what it was the photographer was trying to achieve by doing that series of photographs. And it normally lands up that the best photograph, or the one that would be then used, is towards the end of the roll. He's concentrating so hard on getting to that particular point that unless he's done a very good photograph almost by accident to start with, he'll build up towards the photograph that he wants to use. That's the normal procedure, and that's why you have contact sheets. And on Apollo, we have those contact sheets. We have them as a record online of all the photographs in every magazine, which is what Jack White has used to produce his figures. And there is a complete dichotomy between the number of photographs that we see having been taken on the Apollo missions and the time available to take them. Because they weren't just there to take photographs, they were doing a lot of other things as well. And on the latter missions, they were driving around in their buggies. You can't take photographs when you're driving around in a buggy. It won't come out. It'll be all...
Well, today's camera, that's the problem, is people with today's camera. I mean, you can run around with them and like all of the sensors in there to create an image on a thing. And I mean, like even the most modern cameras today, I mean, I'm watching a video and the guy's got it on a selfie stick. It's shooting directly back and you can't see the stick. It disappears as well.
I have a video camera here that had stabilization on it. That's 1992. Click a little button and it stabilized the video.
Yeah.
I mean, that's crazy. So how come they had that in 1992 for a $1,000 Super 8 camcorder, and where is it all now? I mean, now you have it on your phones, but I don't see any of these guys flicking the button and turning it on. No, they have to have selfie sticks and go out and buy a gimbal with a stabilizer on it. I don't understand that if my camera had it in 92.
Yeah, it's simple today. I mean, about 30, 40 years ago, you had something called vibration reduction, and there's a VR button on the lens. It was normally on the lens, and that would reduce vibration when you were holding a camera.
When Kubrick came out with that shoulder harness, like Scott's talking about, yeah, that cured everything. I think it had shocks on it.
The guy could hop up and down and the whole thing would sit there and it just slowly move around like that.
Yeah.
There are videos available online on how that device was worked, but it's a big armature thing on it.
Like what we're talking about here is vibration reduction in cameras available in the 1960s. the Hasselblad, and the lenses. And I don't think they were available then. In fact, I'm pretty sure they weren't.
Not for a Hasselblad.
No, because the Hasselblad lenses are really quite magnificent pieces of technology.
Yeah, everything's built inside of the lens. It's not in the camera. They have little motors and everything in those lenses. Now you see all those little contact points at the end of the lens. That's for the motor, the little motor to adjust the focus and stuff in there if it's automatic.
But that's not what they had for the Apollo missions. They were all manual.
It's noticeable how few of the Apollo photographs show camera shake, which is quite distinctive when you see it. Right, maybe they didn't get the focus right on a few pictures, but very few. And given the conditions they were operating under, and the conditions that they were holding the camera with, the pressurized gloves, the spacesuit, the inability to see the shutter button, inability to see the focus aperture and shutter speed rings from inside the spacesuit, these are miraculous photographs taken by miraculous astronauts who had a lot of other things to do on the moon, we're told. They got to plant the flag, they got to speak to the president, they got to collect the rocks, they got to get back in their buggy. They had all these things to do, and they're taking one photograph every 50 seconds.
But what about all those little parts, even if it's manually operated? What would happen if they just suddenly cold welded themselves together?
It wouldn't work.
Exactly. Don't forget these things didn't have any lubricant because that would just off gas. They already knew that. So all of those beautiful pieces of equipment at 10 to the minus 11, they're going to cold weld them together, especially the shutters. And then, of course, the film's going to just, and the batteries are going to go, and that's...
No photographs for the records. So they had to recreate them.
Well, you'd have to go there first to know that they're not going to work. Even putting them in a vacuum chamber, which they did do some testing on the cameras, they still couldn't reproduce the vacuum. So how are you going to certify it?
And then the other interesting fact, too, is that when I was saying about how the motor, you could hear the motor inside of the lens. See, what happened when you turned the focus ring on the lens, it was actually activating a motor inside the lens. This is Zeiss we're talking about. We're talking about the Zeiss lenses that they used supposedly on the lunar surface.
Yeah.
So, and they didn't have that kind of stuff in there.
Yeah, they didn't.
Not the ones they used.
Well, that little electric motor would cold weld itself together as well.
Yeah.
I mean, you're just looking at straight physics.
I'm looking at a 2013 article then when they were taking these apart to look how they had done it with that little motor in there. So whether they had that in the 60s, I don't know. I'll have to look that up.
I don't think they did. Not in the Hasselblad lenses, the Zeiss lenses.
They're manually operated, so...
Yeah, they were manually operated. That was the whole point of them.
Yeah.
And they were very good lenses. They had extremely high resolution because Zeiss knew how to grind photographic lenses.
Talking about the autofocus in there, that was how they worked. Interesting, in 2007, when this article was written, November 8th, 2007, Zeiss lenses still did not have a CPU or an actuating motor inside for the focus.
In 2007.
Yeah, it says that the next article is November 17th, 2016, and now they have the motor inside of it. So when you're moving the focus ring, the motor's actually turning the lens chamber. This is according to Zeiss.
But not in the late 60s.
No, and as a matter of fact, I'm going to show this video of them taking it apart, showing that motor inside.
So we got 2007, they were talking about it then. Not in 1967. They weren't talking about it then because they hadn't been thought of.
Here's another point with the lenses. I tried to look up to see what kind of filters were put on the lenses, especially for UV radiation and ultraviolet light on there, because if you didn't compensate for the full amount of light that you're traveling in space with, the increase in the amount of sunlight that you're getting, the UV and everything else coming into that, like in the infrared, those lenses would have needed filters for the infrared and the ultraviolet, as well as to bring it down, as well as you're almost 50% more white light as well coming into those lenses. Those cameras would have needed to be calibrated for that to be on the lunar surface or to be even shooting in space. They'd have to have those filters on there to get an actual color picture. And I couldn't find anything on those.